Hey everyone, how's it going? This is Azren, the language nerd here. I'm the owner of the Calgary Language Nerds, and welcome to today's podcast, which of course has video. Now, today, the video people can probably tell that I'm using my computer. I'm not using my typical camera, which is my cell phone. Okay. And the reason I'm doing so is that in today's episode, I'd like to do some screen sharing. I'd like to show you a few things on my computer that are going to be relevant visuals for today's podcast topic. So if you're listening to this on audio, so on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whatever it is, if you can, this would be a good episode to go watch on YouTube when you get a moment so you can see some of the accompanying visuals. If you're not able to do that, people listening just on audio, no problem. It'll still be relevant. You'll still be able to follow along. However, I do think that having the visuals will add to the educational experience of this episode. Today, we're going to talk about the CEFR. Many of you probably know what the CEFR is, but I'm going to tell you a whole bunch of things and show you something about the CEFR, which you probably didn't know. Now, if you are a newer language learner and perhaps you haven't heard of the CEFR, let's start right from the beginning. Let's start from what is the CEFR and why does it matter to a language learner? Well, the CEFR is a system, it's a framework, more specifically, that is used to measure proficiency in a wide variety of languages. The CEFR stands for the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. There are 6 different levels in the CEFR. We have, and this is where I can use a visual, so I'll do a screen share. There are 6 different levels, as you can see in this visual. There's a A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, and C2. A1 is the lowest level of proficiency that you can have. It's not the lowest level because you could have below an A1, but an A1, if you were to get an official certificate demonstrating your proficiency, A1 would be the first certificate someone could get. So A1's the lowest, then we have A2, then we have B1, B2, C1, and C2. If you're listening to this podcast / watching this video, it's quite possible, it's maybe even probable that you've heard of this scale before. Now, if we scroll down a little bit here, you'll see this rainbow. We'll see figure 4, a rainbow, and figure 5, the conventional 6 colors. I love this analogy that's used in this document. This document, by the way, what we're looking at on video, I'll make sure I put a link in the podcast description as well as the video description for those that are interested. This is I'll go back up to the top. This is the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, Learning Teaching Assessment document, and this is the companion volume. So it's a long document, 278 pages. I've read most of it. I skimmed certain sections, but I went through a lot of it recently, and I found it to be a very enlightening document, even though it is a very long read. Now, let's look at these 2 pictures here. So for the podcast people that can't see my screen, there are 2 different figures. One is a picture of a real rainbow, and the second is basically a rainbow, but just showing the conventional 6 colors that we have: red, orange, yellow, so on and so forth. So when we look at the conventional 6 colors, we can see these 6 colors very clearly. We have red and orange and yellow, but in a real life rainbow, obviously the colors bleed into each other a little bit. And fluency, and more specifically proficiency with foreign languages, is far more like a real rainbow than it is like a representation of the 6 conventional colors. Because even though we have 6 major colors in, for example, this rainbow on my screen, even though that's the case, when it comes to one's level of proficiency, often you'll find yourself in between levels, or you're not exactly in one level. I found this pretty interesting. I like the analogy that they used, and so I wanted to use it for today's podcast episode. Now, here's where things get pretty interesting. If we go to the CEFR website, I'm going to do this right now on my screen. Let's go to CEFR levels explained. And let's go to this link up here. I'll read this out for the podcast audio people as well, don't worry. So a lot of language learners are probably aware of this particular table. This table is called the global scale common reference levels. And basically on the global scale, we have 6 levels, A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2, and there's a short description provided of each one. So I'll read you an example. If we look at, for example, the B1 level, B1 is like a lower intermediate level. It says the following: can understand the main points of clear standard input on familiar matters regularly encountered in work, school, leisure, etc. Can deal with most situations likely to arise whilst traveling in an area where the language is spoken. Can produce simple connected text on topics which are familiar or of personal interest. Can describe experiences and events, dreams, hopes, and ambitions, and briefly give reasons and explanations for opinions and plans. So there's a short little blurb about each level. And for most people, this is enough. But what fascinates me is that if we go back to the companion volume, the level descriptions are far more detailed than that. So let me show you an example. And again, don't worry, audio people, I'll read these out to you so you can keep following along in case you're not watching on YouTube. So this here in the companion volume, we're looking at the table of contents, okay? And I want to focus specifically on chapter 3. So in chapter 3, we can see 3.11, reception activities. We have oral comprehension, which breaks down into various subcategories: overall oral comprehension, understanding conversation between other people, understanding as a member of a live audience, understanding announcements and instructions, understanding audio or signed media and recordings. We have another subsection here, which is watching TV, film, and video. And that's basically it. So we have these subcategories of oral comprehension. I find this, at least for me personally, I found it insightful and interesting that the CEFR has separate criteria for understanding conversations between people, understanding something if you're in a live audience, understanding announcements, understanding recordings and such, understanding TV, film, videos. I think it's cool that they have different requirements for each one, because in reality, when you think about one's oral comprehension, you will be stronger in certain aspects and weaker in other aspects, meaning you might be really good at understanding a conversation between other people, but the second you try and watch TV, film, or a video, it's way more difficult. And so when you understand that the CEFR has separate criteria for each one of those categories, at least for me, I think it can be a relief to many language learners, because now you can understand, oh, right, that's why I'm good at understanding conversations between other people, for example. But when I listen to announcements, when I travel to such and such country and I hear the announcements at the bus station, I don't understand anything. Right, it's because I'm not as good at this one aspect of oral comprehension, but I am much better at that aspect of oral comprehension. It also can explain why some people feel on some days that they're way more fluent than other days, or that they're stronger in their target language on last week Monday than they are today. There's fluctuations that happen on a day-by-day basis. Well, one of the reasons might be that 2 days ago, maybe if we're referring to listening, maybe you were listening to a podcast and you understood very well and you felt really good about yourself. But then 2 days later, you were listening to a conversation between other people and you didn't understand anything. And it could just be that your TV, film, and video comprehension is much better than your comprehension, for instance, between other people or part of a live audience. Now, if we keep scrolling down here, you'll notice that every single skill is broken down into subcategories. So even reading is broken down into reading correspondence, reading for orientation, reading for information and argument, reading instructions, reading as a leisure activity. There's so much. When we get to the speaking section, we have sustained monologues describing an experience. This means, can you tell a story, basically? Can you, I'm assuming that's what that means, right? Sustained monologue, giving information, sustained monologue, putting in a case, for example, in a debate, public announcements, addressing audiences. They even have a criteria for addressing audiences. That is not the first thing people think about when it comes to their speaking skill. They've thought through each level, and they've broken it down into so many subcategories. There's a couple categories I particularly like that I would like to highlight in today's podcast. The first one here, let's go to production strategies. This is on page 68. Production, let's scroll down a little bit more. Production strategies. Let's go to, I'll show you a couple of these. So production strategies, we can measure one's planning ability. So if you're advanced in planning, in other words, you have a C2 or C1 level in planning, right? You can, when preparing in a more formal text, consciously adopt the conventions linked to the particular type of text concerned. For example, structure, level, formality, right? If we keep going down a little bit, I particularly like the monitoring and repair section, because monitoring and repair is a very important skill for language learners. What that means is where you want to say something, but then you realize when you're going to say it that you don't have the word to say the thing that you want to say. So then can you go back and correct your thinking and correct what you're going to say and do so in a natural fashion? So if you're super advanced, if you're like a C2, it means that you can backtrack and restructure around a difficulty so smoothly that the interlocutor is hardly aware of it, meaning the other person doesn't even notice that you made a mistake or that you tried to avoid something you didn't know how to say. Whereas if you're more on the beginner side, A2 or A1, in fact, they don't even have descriptors available. You can't even be a beginner at that. I guess maybe they don't even have a description for it for one reason or another. So it's pretty cool. I mean, I would recommend going through this document. It's pretty cool. It's very long, obviously, but it's a very long document. As I said, 278 pages. Maybe you can skim the sections that are not as relevant to you. But I bet you anything, if you go through this document, you're going to find certain things, particularly in chapter 3, I would say, but maybe other chapters too. You're going to find some things that are relevant to you that you find quite helpful. If you're someone, for the very small percentage of you that are watching this or listening to this, that maybe you make lesson plans or curriculums, this kind of document and the research in here is it's very helpful for curriculum designers, maybe teachers as well. Very, very helpful. At least I find it is for me, being a teacher and who makes at least curriculums for my students and such. Okay. The last thing I'd like to show you here, or rather mention and show you, let's go over to page, I forget which page it's on. I think it is on page 36. Let's double check here, or maybe 37. Here we go. I want to give a fun fact about the CEFR, which you probably didn't know. So even if you knew of these 6 levels, even if you knew of the companion, this companion guide, even if you knew of all this, here's something that you probably didn't know. So conventionally, everyone will say, many people will say, teachers will say, a lot of language learners will say that a C2 is the highest level, meaning if you were to go take an exam and get your C2 level, like that's about as advanced as you can get. Now, there's a smaller percentage of people that will even say, actually, that's not true. You could really be higher than a C2. A C2 is not as high as you get, but they're not able to defend why they feel that way. They can't provide an academic, empirically confirmed resource or study, for example, that would prove that, yeah, this is true. But it turns out that this actually has been proven. So people watching the video, I'm going to zoom in on this section of the companion guide, and I'll just read it to you guys here. Okay. Background to the CEFR levels. The 6-level scheme is labeled upwards from A to C precisely because C2 is not the highest imaginable level for proficiency in an additional language. In fact, a scheme, is it schema or schema or scheme? It's not important. A scheme including 7th level had been proposed by David Wilkins at an intergovernmental symposium held in 1977 to discuss a possible European unit credit scheme. The CEFR Working Party adopted Wilkins' first 6 levels because Wilkins' 7th level is beyond the scope of mainstream education. In the SNSF research project that empirically confirmed the levels and developed the CEFR illustrative descriptors published in 2001, the existence of the 7th level was confirmed. So they've confirmed, right? They've confirmed that there is the 7th level of proficiency that's above a C2. Back to the text. There were users/learners studying interpretation and translation at the University of Lausanne, I don't know how to pronounce that, who were clearly above a C2. Indeed, simultaneous interpreters at European institutions and professional translators operate at a level well above C2. For instance, C2 is a third of 5 levels for literary translation recently produced in the Petra project. In addition, many plurilingual writers display Wilkins' 7th level of ambilingual proficiency without being bilingual from birth. So it's kind of like that 7th level, for example, is something like, it's something like having a true bilingualism, whereas C2 is something like extremely, extremely advanced, something to that effect. I'm going to stop the screen share here. So as a final anecdote, and then I can finish off this episode. So I speak 5 different languages. I speak English, French, Spanish, Mandarin, and Gujarati. My English, French, and Spanish are my strongest languages. Now, my French and Spanish are definitely at the C2 level. There are certain subcategories of the companion guide that maybe I'd be closer to a C1 because I don't practice those skills. So I believe one of the criteria, one of the sub skills that they measure in the document, I believe, is job interviews, if I remember correctly. I don't think I've ever done a job interview in French or Spanish. So if I had to do one right now, my proficiency would probably be something closer to a C1 than a C2, for example, but generally speaking, I'm at a C2 in both languages. And my experience has been that in order for me anyway, and probably for many others, but let's just talk about me, my personal experience here, because maybe it's different for others. For me, if I wanted to have that elusive 7th level of proficiency, I feel like there have been times where I do have that level, but those have all been times where I've been in a country that speaks French or Spanish, and I've spent a considerable amount of time there. So an example might be when I spent 3 months in France as a high school student. At that point in time, I remember being there and thinking to myself, God, I'm basically interchangeable. I'm actually basically interchangeable, French and English, and it feels just as natural. In fact, to the point where I was forgetting a lot of English words, and it felt unnatural to speak in English. Now, at a 15-year-old, the CEFR descriptors are a bit different. So they have a different criteria for people that are teenagers, but that's a topic for another day. But still, it's been those times where I've been in a country and spent a good amount of time there every day, living and breathing the language. There have been times like that where I feel like maybe I'm closer to that elusive 7th level. And when I'm in Canada, like I am now, and yes, I speak my languages every day or almost every day, but ultimately English is the primary language I use. I definitely feel like I have that C2 level, but I feel like I lose that elusive, that C3 level, that D1 level, that one level higher. I feel like I kind of lose that. And the only way I get it back is when I go spend time in a country that speaks the language, French or Spanish in my case. Then I can feel like, oh, I'm getting back up to that 7th level that I have had before. But it's so hard to maintain that 7th level. It can be anyway, because it's the language is evolving so much. There are new words that are coming up. it takes a lot of time and effort to maintain it. You have to speak with native speakers. You have to speak in a variety of situations. You have to read and write, and there's so much to it that if you're not in the country, my initial thinking as of right now is perhaps it's not possible, or at least very difficult to have that 7th level, that highest level, call it. And maybe the maximum, if you're not in the country, is perhaps a C2. What do you guys think about that? Let me know on YouTube. Let me know in the comments. Audio people, podcast people, maybe let me know on Instagram or Twitter, any social media platforms you use. My username is the same everywhere, at Polyglot Azren. Yeah, I guess we'll wrap up here. Thanks for your guys' attention, and we'll chat soon. Bye-bye.